Hello everybody, welcome to Tea and Books, or as I call it, the big comfy chair. Welcome. I think I got the whole reversed book covers thing worked out this week, but of course it's a little disconcerting for me because I look backwards to myself now, but I just won't look. So welcome first and second time viewers of our Tea and Books. Today we're going to talk about 3 different books, and I will try and keep it not too long. We shouldn't go over a half hour. The way I choose the books that I talk about, I like to have a little bit of a mix because I read a lot of different genres. So today we're going to have a literary fiction book, and then we're going to have a nonfiction book, and we're going to have one that's more of a light fiction. I won't call it a beach read, but along that line. So the book that we're starting with today is actually somewhat, many of you might have read it already because it did win the Booker. She shared the Booker with Margaret Atwood, and that is this one, Girl, Woman, Other, by Bernardine Evaristo. She's a well-known author in the UK. She's written many books. And as I said, this year she won the Man Booker Prize and shared it with The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. But I really think that this book is excellent. It really stands on its own. It has a lot of different stories in it. It has it follows each different protagonist for a little while. Some of them are linked together quite closely, like you might have the first story from the mother, and then a story from her daughter, and then a story of a school friend of theirs or a business partner, and it connects in a really beautiful way. But the nice thing about it is it gives, I think, a wonderful overview of the sort of social history of being Black in the UK. So all of these different women come from different backgrounds, and each of them have a very different lived experience, and I think it's fascinating to go through that and to see how having that identity plays out in different ways depending on whether you're in the theater or whether you're married with children or whether you're a lesbian or whether you're transgender, and whether you're poor or wealthy, or even to bring it right into the 21st century, there's one story that touches on someone who grew up adopted, assuming they were white, and then did a genetic test as an adult and found out that that wasn't actually the case, and were able to find their birth parents. And so some of the stories are really interesting. They're all very dynamic women, and I really just loved the book. It was so wonderful to explore the history of the UK through so many different women and so many different perspectives, and to think about race and how it affects people growing up in the UK and growing up Black in any country in the world. So it was just a really wonderful book. I would really recommend it. I'm going to read a little portion out of it. And this is from near the beginning of the book. It's talking about Yaz, and Yaz is the young daughter of the first protagonist, Amma, that you meet in the book. Yaz was born 19 years ago in a birthing pool in Amma's candlelit living room. Surrounded by incense, the music of lapping waves, a doula and midwife, Shirley and Roland, her great friend, who'd agreed to father her child when the death of her parents triggered an unprecedented and all-consuming broodiness. Luckily for her, Roland, 5 years into his partnership with Kenny, had also been thinking about fatherhood. He took Yaz every other weekend as agreed, which Amma regretted when she found herself missing her newborn instead of feeling deliriously free from Friday afternoons to Sunday evenings. Yaz was the miracle she never thought she wanted, and having a child really did complete her, something she rarely confided because it somehow seemed anti-feminist. Yaz was going to be her counter-cultural experiment. She breastfed her wherever she happened to be and didn't care who was offended at a mother's need to feed her child. She took her everywhere, strapped to her back or across her front in a sling, deposited her in the corner of rehearsal rooms or on the table at meetings. She took her on tour on trains and planes in a travel cot that looked more like a carry-all, once almost sending her through an airport scanner and begging them not to arrest her over it. She created the position of 7 godmothers and 2 godfathers to ensure there'd be a supply of babysitters for when her child was no longer quite so compliant and portable. Yaz was allowed to wear exactly what she liked, so long as she wasn't endangering herself or her health. She wanted her to be self-expressed before they tried to crush her child's free spirit through the oppressive regimentation of the education system. She has a photo of her daughter walking down the street wearing a plastic Roman army breastplate over an orange tutu, white fairy wings, a pair of yellow shorts over red and white stripy leggings, a different shoe on each foot, a sandal and a welly, lipstick smudged on her lips, cheeks and forehead of phase, and her hair tied into an assortment of bunches with miniature dolls hanging off the ends. Amma ignored the pitying or judgmental looks from passers-by and small-minded mothers at the playground or nursery. Yaz was never told off for speaking her mind, although she was told off for swearing because she needed to develop her vocabulary. Yaz, say you find Marissa unpleasant or unlikable, rather than describing her as a poo-poo-faced smelly bottom. And although she didn't always get what she wanted, if she argued her case strongly enough, she was in with a chance. Amma wanted her daughter to be free, feminist, and powerful. Later, she took her on personal development courses for children to give her the confidence and articulacy to flourish in any setting. Big mistake. Mom, Yaz said at 14 when she was pitching to go to Reading Music Festival with her friends, it would be to the detriment of my juvenile development if you curtailed my activities at this critical stage in my journey towards becoming the independent and fully self-expressed adult you expect me to be. I mean, do you really want me rebelling against your old-fashioned rules by running away from the safety of my home to live on the streets and having to resort to prostitution to survive and thereafter drug addiction, crime, anorexia, and abusive relationships with exploitative bastards twice my age before my early demise in a crack house? Amma fretted the whole weekend her little girl was away. Adult men had been ogling her daughters since before puberty. There are a lot more pedophiles out there than people realize. A year later, Yaz was calling her a feminazi when she was on her way out to a party, and Amma dared suggest she lower her skirt and heels and raise the scoop of neck of her top so that at least 30% of her body mass was covered, as opposed to the 20% currently given a decency rating. Not to mention the boyfriend, glimpsed when he dropped her off in his car. As soon as Yaz was in the door, Amma was waiting in the hallway to ask her the sort of harmless question any parent would ask. Who is he? What does he do? Hoping Yaz would say he was in the 6th form, a relatively harmless schoolboy then. Yaz replied with deadpan insolence, Mom, he's a 30-year-old psychopath who abducts vulnerable women and locks them in a cellar for weeks on end while he has his wicked way with them before chopping them into pieces and sticking them into a freezer for his winter stews. Then she waltzed upstairs to her room, leaving a whiff of wacky-backy. So that is Yaz and the dynamic between Yaz and Amma, and their opinion of each other is delightful. But I really loved every woman that I met in this book, and I felt immediately interested in each story as I went through, and I really would recommend it. It's well written, and it's also, I believe, going to be featured as our book club pick for our Zoom book club that's happening every other Thursday when Tea and Books is not happening. We had our first Zoom book club last week, and we have another one upcoming. And I should have double-checked before I started this, but I believe that Girl, Woman, Other may be the book for book club next week. So you have possibly the chance to get onto our Overdrive site via the Scugog Public Library website and get a copy of that book to read for book club. And then you can join in and discuss it at book club next Thursday. And if you don't like it, you can talk about that too. The next book I'm going to talk about is my nonfiction pick, and this is another one of my absolute favorite nonfiction writers, Yuval Noah Harari. So those of you, this is getting caught in the sun, Yuval Noah Harari. So he's written a number of huge bestsellers. His first book was Sapiens, about the history of humankind, and then his book after that was called Homo Deus, which was sort of about the future, the present and future of humankind and the sort of trends as he sees them. And then this is his most recent book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And I really enjoyed all of his books. Now, if you don't like nonfiction, it may not be your thing because it is a little bit more philosophical. I personally really like that sort of thing. And it's just a nice way to sort of get an overview. He's a historian. He lives in Israel, but he's become hugely famous. He's one of Bill Gates' favorite writers. He's always on all of the must-read lists for nonfiction. And it's just, I find it really enjoyable to read. It really makes me think. You may not always agree with his position because he has very, very strong opinions, but it always makes for an interesting read. So I will give you a little flavor of that just right from the beginning, where he's talking a little bit about the influence of political systems on the 20th century. Humans think in stories rather than in facts, numbers, or equations. And the simpler the story, the better. Every person, group, and nation has its own tales and myths. But during the 20th century, the global elites in New York, London, Berlin, and Moscow formulated three grand stories that claim to explain the whole past and to predict the future of the entire world. The fascist story, the communist story, and the liberal story. The fascist story explained history as a struggle among different nations and envisioned a world dominated by one human group that violently subdues all others. The communist story explained history as a struggle among different classes and envisioned a world in which all groups are united by a centralized social system that ensures equality even at the price of freedom. The liberal story explained history as a struggle between liberty and tyranny and envisioned a world in which all humans cooperate freely and peacefully with minimum central control, even at the price of some inequality. The conflict among these three stories reached its first critical peak in the Second World War, which knocked out the fascist story. From the late 1940s to the late 1980s, the world became a battleground between the two remaining stories, communism and liberalism. Then the communist story collapsed and the liberal story was left the dominant guide to the human past and the indispensable manual for the future of the world, or so it seemed to the global elite. The liberal story celebrates the value and power of liberty. It says that for thousands of years, humankind lived under oppressive regimes that allowed people few political rights, economic opportunities, or personal liberties, and which heavily restricted the movements of individuals, ideas, and goods. But people fought for their freedom, and step by step, liberty gained ground. Democratic regimes took the place of brutal dictatorships. Free enterprise overcame economic restrictions. People learned to think for themselves and follow their hearts instead of blindly obeying bigoted priests and hidebound traditions. Open roads, wide bridges, and bustling airports replaced walls, moats, and barbed wire fences. The liberal story acknowledges that not all is well in the world and there are still many hurdles to overcome. Much of our planet is dominated by tyrants, and even in the most liberal countries, many citizens suffer from poverty, violence, and oppression. But at least we know what we need to do to overcome these problems. Give people more liberty. We need to protect human rights, grant everybody the vote, establish free markets, and let individuals' ideas and goods move throughout the world as easily as possible. According to this liberal panacea, accepted in slight variations by George W. Bush and Barack Obama alike, if we just continue to liberalize and globalize our political and economic systems, we will produce peace and prosperity for all. Countries that join this unstoppable march of progress will be rewarded with peace and prosperity sooner. Countries that try to resist the inevitable will suffer the consequences until they too see the light, open their borders, and liberalize their societies, their politics, and their markets. It may take time, but eventually even North Korea, Iraq, and El Salvador will look like Denmark or Iowa. In the 1990s and 2000s, this story became a global mantra. Many governments from Brazil to India adopted liberal recipes in an attempt to join the inexorable march of history. Those failing to do so seemed like fossils from a bygone era. In 1997, U.S. President Bill Clinton confidently rebuked the Chinese government, stating that its refusal to liberalize Chinese politics put it on the wrong side of history. However, since the global financial crisis of 2008, people all over the world have become increasingly disillusioned with the liberal story. Walls and firewalls are back in vogue. Resistance to immigration and to trade agreements is mounting. Ostensibly democratic governments undermine the independence of the judiciary system, restrict the freedom of the press, and portray any opposition as treason. Strongmen in countries such as Turkey and Russia experiment with new types of illiberal democracies and outright dictatorships. Today, few would confidently declare that the Chinese Communist Party is on the wrong side of history. The year 2016, marked by the Brexit vote in Britain and the rise of Donald Trump in the United States, signified the moment when this tidal wave of disillusionment reached the core liberal states of Western Europe and North America. Whereas a few years ago, Americans and Europeans were still trying to liberalize Iraq and Libya at gunpoint, many people in Kentucky and Yorkshire now have come to see the liberal vision as either undesirable or unattainable. Some discovered a liking for the old hierarchical world, and they just don't want to give up their racial, national, or gendered privileges. Others have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that liberalization and globalization are a huge racket empowering a tiny elite at the expense of the masses. In 1938, humans were offered 3 global stories to choose from. In 1968, just 2. And in 1998, a single story seemed to prevail. In 2018, we're down to 0. So there you go. That is a little bit of an idea of his writing style. I find it very engaging. I like the way he thinks and makes me think. And I like that he can be a little bit provocative at times. So I would really recommend him if you do like nonfiction and you do like to read sort of social science leaning books. This is definitely one of the best that I've read in the last couple of years, and I would really recommend Sapiens and Homo Deus as well. I've read everything he's written, and I'm a big fan of his. So now we're going to move to the final book. It's a lot lighter. And it is from Reese Witherspoon's book club. I'm a big fan of the books on her book club. They're very easy reads, but good books, and I try and keep up with them every month. You can look her up online if you're interested, but her books are always just enjoyable reads, very entertaining. So the one I'm talking about today is called The Scent Keeper by Erica Bauermeister. And The Scent Keeper is, it's sort of a coming-of-age story. It's got a little tiny element of magical realism in it, which is something I personally really enjoy. And the story centers around a young woman who grew up on a very remote island with her father and only her father. And she ends up in a situation where, I don't want to give away too much in the story, but she ends up having to leave the island suddenly as a teenager and come out. It's almost, in some ways, I guess you would almost look at it as a little bit of a Tarzan story almost, because she has to come out into a world where there are all of these people and there are cities and villages, and she's never seen any of this. She has literally been on an island with only one person until she became a teenager practically. So it's a very interesting story, and it's a little bit of a mystery from the way it starts, because you don't really know exactly why her father took her to this island. She doesn't know much about his background, so the reader doesn't know that either. And so you're trying to sort of puzzle out, as she's trying to puzzle out, what her father's story was, why he ended up on this island. And then, of course, you know that she's left the island and you want to know how that happened too. So it really is a page turner. I read it very quickly. I had trouble putting it down. And I would really recommend it. I just found it a really intense and easy story to read. So I will read a little bit at the beginning of that to give you an idea of her experience on this island. Back before there was time, I lived with my father on an island, tucked away in an endless archipelago that reached up out of the cold, salt water, hungry for air. Growing up in the midst of the rain and moss and ancient thick-barked trees, it was easy to forget that the vast majority of our island was underwater, descending down 200, 300, 500 bone-chilling feet. Forever, really, for you could never hold your breath long enough to get to the bottom. Those islands were a place to run away, although I didn't understand that at the time. I had nothing to run from and every reason to stay. My father was everything. I've heard people say that someone is their whole world, their eyes filled with stars. But my father was my world, in a way so literal it can still grab my thoughts, pick them up, and toss them around like driftwood in a storm. Our cabin was set in a clearing at the center of the island. We were not the first to live there. Those islands have a long history of runaways. Almost a century ago, there were French fur trappers with accents that lilted and danced, loggers with mountainous shoulders, and fishermen who chased silver-backed salmon. Later came the draft dodgers hiding from war, hippies dodging rules. The islands took them all in. The storms and the long winters spat most out again. The beauty there was raw. It could kill as easily as it could astonish. Our cabin had been built by the truest of runaways. He set up in a place where no one could find him and built his home from trees that he felled himself. He spent 40 years on the island, clearing space for a garden and planting an orchard. One autumn, however, he simply disappeared. Drowned, it was said. After that, the cabin was empty for years until we arrived and found the apple trees, opened the door, raised the population of the island to 2. I don't remember arriving on the island myself. I was too young. I only remember living there. I remember the paths that wandered through those watchful trees, the odor of the dirt beneath our feet, as dark and complicated as fairy tales. I remember our one-room cabin, the big chair by the wood stove, and our collections of stories and science books. I remember the smell of wood smoke and pine pitch in my father's beard as he read to me at night, and the ghostly aroma of the runaways' pipe tobacco, an olfactory reminder that had sunk into the walls and never quite disappeared. I remembered the way the rain seemed to talk to the roof as I fell asleep, and how the fire would snap and tell it to be quiet. Most of all, I remembered the drawers. My father had begun building them when we moved into the cabin, and when he was done, they lined our walls from floor to ceiling. The drawers were small things, their polished wooden fronts no bigger than my child-sized hands. They surrounded us like the forest and islands outside our door. Each drawer contained a single, simple bottle, and inside each bottle was a piece of paper rolled around itself like a secret. The glass stoppers of the bottles were sealed with different colored waxes, red in the top rows, green for those below. My father almost never opened the bottles. "We need to keep them safe," he said. But I could hear the papers whispering inside the drawers, "Come find me." "Please," I'd ask again and again. Finally, he agreed. He took out a leather book filled with numbers and carefully added one to the list. Then he turned to the wall of drawers, pondering his choice. "Up there," I said, pointing up high to where the red wax bottles lived. Stories always begin at the top of a page. My father had built a ladder that slid along the wall, and I watched him climb it almost to the ceiling, reaching into a drawer and drawing out its bottle. When he was back on the ground, he carefully broke the seal. I could hear the glass scritching against glass as he pulled out the stopper, then the rustle of paper as he unrolled it into a plain white square. He leaned in close, inhaling, then wrote another number in the book. I meant to stay still, but I leaned forward too. My father looked up and smiled, holding out the paper. "Here," he said, "breathe in, but not too much. Let the smell introduce itself." I did as he said. I kept my chest tight and my breath shallow. I could feel the tendrils of a fragrance tickling the inside of my nose, slipping into the curls of my black hair. I could smell campfires made from a wood I didn't recognize, dirt more parched than any I had ever known, moisture ready to burst from clouds in a sky I had never seen. It smelled like waiting. "Now breathe in deeply," my father said. I inhaled and fell into the fragrance like Alice down a rabbit hole. Later, after the bottle had been stoppered and sealed and put back in its drawer, I turned to my father. I could still smell the last of the fragrance lingering in the air. "Tell me its story," I asked him. "Please." All right, little lark," he said. He sat in the big chair, and I nestled in next to him. The fire crackled in the wood stove. The world outside was still. "Once upon a time, Emmeline," he began, and his voice rolled around the rhyme of it as if the words were made of chocolate. "Once upon a time, Emmeline, there was a beautiful queen who was trapped in a great white castle. None of the big bold knights could save her. 'Bring me a spell that will break the walls,' she asked a brave young boy named Jack. I listened while the scents found their hiding places in the cracks in the floorboards and the words of the story, and the rest of my life." So that gives you an idea, and that's one of the things I really love about this book, is how beautifully it describes these scents and makes you think of your own favorite smells and scents and the purpose of scent in your memories and the role they play. It was just a really lovely tale, but very anchored in the reality of her mystery that she's trying to puzzle out. So those are my 3 books for the day. All of them are available on our Overdrive collection on the Scugog library website at www.scugoglibrary.ca. And I hope you manage to get a copy and enjoy reading them. And I will hopefully see you again in 2 weeks on June the 4th, and I will post the book list as well on our Facebook page so that you can, if you came in partway through, you can see what all 3 books were. Thanks a lot. See you in 2 weeks.